Okay, hello. Welcome back to episode 7 of Dr. Petrie's World History of the Holocaust. We are going to continue on this slide about the documentation of the Jewish resistance that happened at Treblinka. And one of my pet peeves when studying the Holocaust is there are a lot of these revolts where the Jews that had been imprisoned, once they figured out that they weren't going to be set free and they were going to die, a lot of them fought back. And one of the best movies about this is called Defiance with Daniel Craig. I think I talked about it earlier. And that was about, I believe, a camp in Czechoslovakia. Treblinka was a revolt that was planned by a small group of inmates. And what happened is one of them had stolen and copied a key to the arsenal where they kept all the weapons. They seized these weapons, and they planned to murder the guards, cut the telephone lines, set the camp on fire, and they were successful. And this happened Monday, August 2nd, 1943. You can see in the photo the picture of the smoke from the fire that was set by the inmates. And Treblinka was shut down, but they succeeded in shutting down the camp. But very few inmates survived this effort, this resistance. As the camp burned, the Nazis hunted down the inmates who had escaped into the woods, and they murdered all they could find. Local farmers helped a small number of escapees. Some gave them food and water, others recommended hiding places, and still others provided directions to help the escapees find their ways to safety. In the end, of the hundreds of thousands of Jews that were shipped to Treblinka, and estimates range for over 1 million Jews were shipped there, only about 60 survived. So Treblinka killed 1 million Jews, and only 60 survive this. But it is important to realize that this was one instance of resistance where the Jews were actually victorious over the Germans, but you can't really say they were victorious because only 60 survived. So, continuing with the testimony about escape and survival, you can see in the photo a Jewish man who was shot by the German soldiers lies in the woods. The quote says, "Suddenly we heard the signal, a shot fired into the air. I grabbed some guns and let fly right and left. But when I saw that the road to escape stood open, I picked up an axe and a saw and ran. Every second counted. Then I heard a shot. I turned and I saw a guard. I noticed his weapon had jammed. I slowed down. I pulled the axe from my belt. I came up close to him and struck him with my axe. I was free and I ran into the woods." That is a quote from Jankiel Wernick, who was one of the 60 that survived. And like we said earlier, of the 1,000 inmates that were alive in Treblinka when the revolt happened, only about 200 survived to escape. And of those 200 that escaped, only 60 survived after the Nazis had scoured the surrounding areas looking for prisoners on the run. Still, this is far more than survived other death camps, such as Balzac, where only 2 inmates are known to have survived the camp at all. In all, 700,000 people died at Treblinka while it was operational. 600,000 died at Balzac. And the passage from this slide comes from that book, the Death Camp Treblinka, which was published by the New York Holocaust Library in 1979. So the next slide is other examples of resistance, and Sobibor is one of them. On October 14th, 1943, prisoners revolted, 11 SS men died, 300 prisoners escaped, but unfortunately most were captured, recaptured, and killed. Of that group of 300, 50 survived. From Auschwitz on October 7th, 1944, Jewish prisoners who handled the corpses for the crematoria revolted. They blew up one gas chamber with gunpowder stolen from the munitions factory. Eventually, all escapees were captured and killed. There was a lot of nonviolent resistance, and they said the enemy's intention was for us to be devoured by filth, so the prisoners tried to keep themselves as clean as possible by following the Jewish laws of kosher, being kosher. Violent uprisings in the ghettos and in the camps occurred several times. Some incidents involved just one person. For example, a woman who'd been stripped naked and forced to march into the gas chamber at Treblinka turned on the Nazis, grabbed a gun from one of the soldiers, and managed to fire off a few shots before being killed herself. Other acts of resistance took the form of organized uprisings, like those described in the slide. Prisoners also used smaller, nonviolent acts of resistance to affirm their dignity and humanity. For example, prisoners would maintain a commitment to cleanliness, to care for sick or injured inmates, and secretly keep journals or sketch pictures or say prayers. The quote included in the last bullet on the slide is from Pelagia Lewinska's 20 Months in Auschwitz, which was reprinted in a book called Different Voices, which is published by New York's Paragon House in 1933. The next slide shows citizen resistance, and we're going to talk about the White Rose movement, and we're going to talk about righteous Gentiles. And Gentiles, of course, are what Jews refer to as non-Jews. So if you're not Jewish, you're a Gentile. Not all Germans supported Hitler. One of the groups that didn't support Hitler was the White Rose movement. It was comprised of several young men and one woman. They secretly distributed pamphlets challenging the German population to resist the policies of the Nazis. In early 1943, all of the members were caught, tried for crimes against the state, and executed. The Yad Vashem Museum in Israel recognizes over 11,000 people during the war who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. They are also called the righteous Gentiles. Many hid Jews in their home for years. So this is always a hard question, especially because the German state was so brutal. The Nazis were so brutal. But would you save your life? Would you risk your life to save others in this manner? What are the variables that would influence your decision? And later on, we're going to read about the Mexican Oskar Schindler. There was an ambassador from Mexico living in France that also saved hundreds of Jews. You'll read a newspaper article about him, and I ask you, why isn't this person in your history book? Why isn't Oskar Schindler in your history book? You really have to dig deeper and learn if you really want to learn about the Holocaust. So the next slide talks about the case of Denmark, which is also called the Netherlands, right? And Denmark rescued almost its entire Jewish population. The Nazis rolled in April 9th, 1940. They took over Denmark. They instituted military rule. They demanded, it took them 3 years, but they demanded the deportation of the Jews. And the Danish people transported about 7,000, almost 300 Jews and 686 non-Jews across the sea to Sweden rather than to hand them over to the Nazis. Only 477 Danish Jews ended up in concentration camps. And what you can see is a picture of these Danish fishermen that are taking the Jews to safety over in Sweden. Historian Yada Bauer has written, quote, "The Danish rescue action was largely spontaneous, a reaction to the Nazi disregard of Danish national pride and Danish traditions and religious and political convictions. The case of Denmark illustrates the fact that there were instances in which people acted humanely toward and helped not only their Jewish friends and neighbors, but even total strangers." So we've talked about instances of resistance. In this case, the whole country of Denmark was resistant to the Nazi extermination, the Nazis' final solution. The next slide looks at the victims in the death camps, and you can see that the estimates of the actual number of dead vary widely. In many cases, inmates were sent directly from the trains to the gas chambers, and no accurate account of victims was made. It's generally agreed that the total was 6 million. You can see from this slide the number of victims was greatest at Auschwitz and probably the least at Chelmno. So the next slide talks about, whoops, did I skip and go fast? Other victims of Nazi persecution. And hold on, my family's arriving home, so I'm going to pause you. Well, it's not pausing. Oh, and we're back. We may have a special guest because my wife and child just arrived home, but I want to go through the remaining three slides. This slide talks about other victims of Nazi persecution, and these victims were socialists, communists, anybody who was handicapped, anybody who was gay or lesbian, living what was called a deviant lifestyle, any Christians, any gypsies. The picture is on the right is of a gypsy girl. The hammer and sickle is a symbol for communism, and of course the cross is a symbol for Christianity. So although the Nazis specifically targeted the Jews, they also engaged in a less systematic and less extensive persecution of other groups of people. They did not hesitate to arrest, imprison, torture, or even kill individuals they viewed as a threat to their power, their authority, or their idea of what German society should be. Some estimates from historians are that between 250,000 and 1 million Romani and Sinti gypsies were killed. Disabled, over 200,000 disabled people were killed in an official euthanasia campaign between 1939 and 1941. Homosexuals, between 3,000 and 9,000 German homosexuals were killed. Over 5,000 to 15,000 were killed, according to another historian. So you can see that the Germans, they definitely had plans for other groups after they had killed the Jews, but their priority was killing the Jews first, and then they would worry about these other groups later. So the next slide talks to us about what happens at the camps. Shows us what happened to the camps, I guess. And you can see the survivor weeping at liberation. The Americans or the European soldiers have come and freed them, and this survivor is overcome with joy. So December 1942, Belzec is shut down. The camp only has 2 survivors. In March 1943, Chelmno is shut down. It is reopened in June and July 1944 to gas Jews from the Lodz ghetto before the Allies could get to it and shut it down permanently. In August 1943, there's a prisoners' revolt at Treblinka. The camp is destroyed. There's only 60 survivors. October 1943, there's a prisoners' revolt in Sobibor. The camp is again totally destroyed. July 1944, Majdanek is liquidated, meaning, dismantled as the Soviet army advances. The prisoners from that camp are shipped to Auschwitz. And then in January 1945, Auschwitz is abandoned by the Nazis, and the prisoners are forced to go on a death march west. So in the image on this slide, you see the survivor weeping when he learns he will not be among the first shipped to a hospital. Some of the camps, including Belzec and Sobibor, were completely destroyed by the Nazis. German troops razed the buildings, burned the buildings, tore down the fences, and plowed over the grounds. The Nazis essentially tried to destroy evidence that would reveal the extent of their crimes. So the next slide is going to chronicle the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto, and I'm going to quickly go through that. The Nazi general Jürgen Stroop cannot be considered an objective reporter. He claimed that he captured 56,065 Jews, killed 7,000, deported another 7,000 to Treblinka, and destroyed 631 bunkers in the Warsaw Ghetto. The fact that a few hundred ghetto fighters were able to hold out against the Germans for a month provides a testament to their extraordinary courage and heroism. I would encourage you to take down the timeline. I'm going to finish the last slide, which is what the Allies knew. And it looks like I'm about to run out of time, so we'll cover this slide in the next presentation.